Friends, I welcome you to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It is not difficult for you, but it is pleasant for me. And we're starting. Allender, are you ready? My husband called. They were going to the mountains for 2 weeks to hunt elk. She was looking for her foam mat. She knew that sleeping on the ground would be very uncomfortable without some kind of foam between the body and the ground could be wet and cold. Brian, have you seen my rug? I've already put it in the truck, he said. She grabbed her backpack from the floor by the door and they walked to the truck. It was going to be a long trip. Brian Salen watched as his wife went outside and walked along the sidewalk. He still couldn't believe that he had persuaded her to marry him. They had been married for 3 months, and his heart was pounding every time he looked at her. She was a tall, slender, dark-haired girl. Her hair was black with a bluish sheen. She was wearing tight blue jeans and a buttoned-up white blouse. She looked so beautiful that he wanted to take her back and use her right now. She was clearly not wearing a bra. She was bright and athletic, and it was easy to tell by the way her ass stuck out, making men drool. She climbed in and looked at him. "What? What is it?" she asked. "I just can't believe how beautiful you are." She smiled, flashing white teeth in a creamy face. She had sparse, pale, almost translucent skin, and was careful as she spent a lot of time outdoors, running around their neighborhood every morning and spending many days by the backyard pool. They both loved hiking and hunting. This was the second time they had been together, and he knew that she was an excellent shot with any weapon. Her father raised deer and elk on the Upper Peninsula, and they were looking forward to hunting. She hoped to take at least one of them. Brian didn't really like bow hunting, but he admired it. She looked at her boyish husband and felt her insides warm up. She knew how lucky she was. She was a little excited looking at him. He was an amazing lover, and Allender couldn't get enough of him. They were going to wait a bit to have children. They just enjoyed being married. Brian was a dream come true for her. They met in their senior year of college, and she knew that she had found the other half of her soul. There was just something about him that made her melt. He was smart, witty, and had a sense of humor that matched hers. He was an outdoor person just like her, and he was the hottest man she had ever met. Those big brown eyes, a swimmer's body, and an amazing lover. Allender was in love, lusted, and married the man she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. It was a long way to Colorado, and they stopped for the night in Des Moines. In the late afternoon of the next day, they entered Salida and met their guides there. They were introduced, and they immediately liked one of them. Peter Thompson was a small cowboy, about 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighing 120 pounds. He looked to be in his late 40s, wiry and light on his feet. The second guide was Reince Parker. He was completely different. He was about 6 feet 5 inches tall, weighed 250 pounds, and looked like a refugee from the 60s. He had long black hair pulled back in a ponytail and was very quiet. Allender thought he looked to be in his early 20s and very good looking. His arms were heavy with muscles, and it seemed as if he had no neck. When he shook her hand, she felt very small. Since she was almost 6 feet tall herself, she was a little worried. "Don't mind Rains," Peter chuckled. "In the 3 months I've known him, he hasn't said 500 words. He's a college student. He played football for the Raiders for a while, but he knows the forest. His father was a forester in these parts, and he knows the area like the back of his hand." They had dinner, and Brian and Allender tasted bison for the first time. Rains cooked the food, and she came over to ask if she needed help. "No, I can handle it myself," he said. His voice was the lowest bass Allender had ever heard. If a grizzly bear could talk, she thought that would be exactly what it would sound like. "You can set the table if you want," he said. "The dishes are in that cupboard over there. The silverware is in the bottom drawer." She set the table, and Peter poured her a nice red wine. The bison was delicious, and Rains was a good cook. They talked about where they were going, and when she mentioned that she wanted to use a bow, Rains's eyes lit up. "Do you hunt with a bow?" "What is it?" she asked him. He nodded. "What kind of bow do you have?" he asked. "I shoot a 65-pound bear bow with Quest Power Punch arrows with 125 Hellraiser grain points," she said. "I'm learning to use a longbow, but I'm not confident enough to try it yet. I'm making my own bow, but it's not ready yet." He stared at her for a while. "I am surprised and impressed. Most women can't handle such a burden." "Well, that's something new," Peter laughed. "Rains is not easily impressed. Do you hunt with a bow too, Brian?" "No, it's too much work for me," Brian laughed. Well, we'll send these two and we'll kill someone too, Peter said to Brian. Last season, my clients and I killed 5 moose Allender, Rains said. Her big blue eyes were shining with excitement. I want something delicious, she said. It doesn't have to be huge, but I want a good one. Brian just wants a moose too. He's going to get it, Rains told her, if he can get Peter to shut up and come closer. Peter is really very good. They went to bed early and got up at 6 in the morning. It was very cold, and Allender shivered until she put on her gear. They put on many layers of clothes, and by the time Allender got dressed, Rains had already prepared breakfast. They ate quickly in a hurry to leave, and when they were done, Rains tied the horses outside. Allender tied the bow to the saddle and they climbed into the saddle. She was a little stiff after yesterday's trip, and it seemed to her that her joints were creaking. Soon she straightened up and, when they left the path, kissed Brian. Brian and Peter continued on their way, and Rains led her along a winding path that skirted the mountain and climbed steeply up the slope. They drove for about an hour, and suddenly a view of the Grand Canyon opened up in front of her. Rains took his glasses out of his saddlebag and she followed him. At 3 o'clock, he told her, about 2 miles from here, on the other side of these aspens. She looked up and saw 6 moose moving across the clearing. What do you think? What is it? She asked. The second bull looks pretty big from here. He's pretty cute, he told her. He's not a record holder, but he's very nice. Are you interested? Are you hoping to find something better? What is it? She asked him. Yes, but you have to look for it. Let's try it and see what we can do. The best is the enemy of the good. She agreed, and they drove into the canyon. By the time Rains rode up and dismounted, it was getting hot, and Allender was getting hot. They tied up the horses, and she took off 2 layers. She felt that she was being watched, and looked at Rains. He looked at her with obvious approval. What the hell? She felt a little awkward. Her face flushed slightly, and she turned to him. What? Nothing. You are a very beautiful woman. I'm sorry if I inconvenienced you. She shrugged her shoulders. Brian always tells me that. For some reason, she felt she should mention her husband. Forget it. Let's go hunting. She lowered her bow and took out her arrows. They came closer to the place where the moose had just been and looked in. Allender's heart sank. They were 1/2 mile away and moving on. Well, shall we try to get ahead of them? What is it? She asked. No, I don't think so, Rain said thoughtfully. We'd have to climb over that wall and we wouldn't be able to take the horses. By the time we get up, we don't know where they'll be. Let's go to the next canyon to the south and see what we see there. They made 2 more trips that day. One of them was empty, and Allender didn't want the bull to be close enough. His horn was broken, and Rains agreed that she should give it up. It was already late, and they decided to return. They rode in companionable silence for most of the way. Before they reached the cabin, Rains stopped. I have an idea, he said. It means getting up around 3 and driving for 3 hours, but there's a big bull there that I'd love to point you at. What do you think? I'm in the game. Look, Rains, I'm not disappointed with today. I just love being here. I want a moose, but it's just a bonus. Being in this place, hunting, that's what's important to me. Brian and Peter had already returned when they arrived. They had seen a moose, but they were in a canyon that they couldn't get into from their position, and they were going to try to capture it tomorrow. They had dinner, and the next morning Allender and Rains set off early. It was very cold when they got up, and they had a quick breakfast and saddled the horses before the others got up. The ride through the dark forest had unsettled Allender a little, and she was glad that Rains was with her and knew where they were going. When the sun rose, they approached the place where they wanted to hunt, and at 10:30, Allender noticed a group of moose in the aspen thickets. They followed and found themselves about 200 yards from the largest moose Allender had ever seen. It started to rain, and the moose were restless. We have to do this now, Rains whispered. They're going to move to a safer hiding place. When we get up, you take it, you have a chance. That's a very good bull, Allender. She moved closer, waiting for the bull to lower its head to make a dash. He turned a little more to the side, and Allender, crouching down, fired an arrow. It was a perfect shot, right behind the front foot and just below the center. The huge animal shuddered and rushed forward as if fired from a cannon. Allender was shaking with adrenaline, and she rushed at Rains. Did you see that? I got him, Rains. You couldn't have taken a better shot. Her arms wrapped around his neck, and she pulled him to her to hug and kiss his cheek. It's huge. How long do we have to wait to go in search of him? She calmed down a little and realized that her body was wrapped around him and blushed even more. She pulled free and moved away a little. Let's get the horses and then follow him, Rain suggested. It was raining heavily and the temperature seemed to be plummeting. The sky was completely overcast and cold steam rose from the ground. They led the horses to the place where she had fired the arrow and began to search for the trail. It was easy to walk through the aspen thickets, and when they reached the edge of the meadow after a quarter of a mile, they quickly found the moose almost exactly in the center of the clearing. Allender asked Rains to take some pictures, and she also took a picture of him standing by the moose. They immediately set to work bandaging the animal, and Rains helped her quarter it. They wrapped him in plastic, which he brought with him, and put him in canvas bags for transportation. By the time they tied him to the horses, it was snowing heavily, and visibility was close to zero. The wind began to howl, and strangely for Allender, lightning crackled around. She was very scared, and Rains was walking pretty fast. After half a mile, he stopped in front of her and got off his horse. He put his hand to her ear and shouted to be heard over the howling wind. There's a stone wall about 20 feet ahead. Keep an eye out for a canopy, a blockage, a cave, or anything we can use for shelter. We need to find a place to sit down. She nodded. They moved forward and a wall came into view. They walked along it for about half a mile, and it gradually ended. We have to go back the other way and look for it, Rains shouted in her ear. Now the ground was covered with snow, and it was getting thicker. They turned back, and after walking 100 yards, they could no longer see their tracks. Allender was wearing good gear, but in some places the water had seeped out and she was shivering as the heat left her body. A dark opening in the wall appeared ahead, and Rains dismounted and examined it. It was large at the entrance and extended for about 15 feet before shrinking into a narrow throat. They led the horses into the first room and looked into the narrow passage. Beyond the neck, they saw another small room, about 6 feet by 6 feet. Allender was trembling uncontrollably, and Rains realized that she was in trouble. I'm going to find some wood to make a fire, he said. Take everything off the horses if you can. We can use the blankets and pads they have under their saddles. Find my lighters in my backpack and I'll make a fire as soon as I can. Work will help you stay warm. Allender was so cold that she could barely concentrate, but she began to unsaddle the horses when Rains took an axe and disappeared into the snow. She cursed her stupid stiff fingers as she fumbled with the girths. She managed to remove the saddles and she put the pads on the floor of the small room, on top of which were blankets. She put down her foam pillow and put pillows and blankets on it. Fumbling clumsily in Rain's backpack, she managed to open it and found a dry bag with 3 lighters and a jar of liquid inside. She made a circle of large stones right inside the narrow part of the shallow cave. The smoke should come out when they build a fire there, and it will also give the horses some warmth. By the time she had finished, Rains had returned with an armful of dry firewood, which he had broken off from the standing trees. He quickly broke off small branches and built a small wigwam out of them in the center of the stone circle. He gradually broke up larger pieces until there were pieces the size of his wrist on top. Allender helped, and soon they had a decent pile. Rains sprinkled lighter fluid on the smallest twigs and soaked them well. He made a small trace of liquid and lit it with a lighter. Flames ran up the trail and the pile burst into flames. 10 minutes later, they built a good fire, and Allender stretched out her frozen hands to the fire. She was shaking and her teeth were chattering. Rains was very worried when he looked at her and saw that her lips were bluish in color. Allender, are you wet? Yes, some of my clothes are wet and I'm freezing, she said through chattering teeth. We need to dry your clothes, he told her. You'll never get warm while you're in wet clothes. Take off everything wet and wrap yourself in blankets. We'll hang your clothes on sticks by the fire to dry. The last thing she wanted to do was undress in the cold air, but she was freezing. Don't look, she told him. I swear, he promised. Do you want to be humble or lively? She walked away and stripped down to her bra and panties. Her bra was also wet and she took it off, quickly wrapping herself in a blanket. She hurried back to the fire, and Rains gathered up her clothes. He stuck sticks in the rocks and hung her clothes on sticks closer to the fire. She was still trembling uncontrollably, and Rains was very worried. After a certain point of hypothermia, she was unlikely to recover, and it was necessary to warm her up quickly. She was very sleepy and lethargic and did not notice how he took off his clothes. She was a little startled when he picked her up and laid her on the saddle cushions he had brought closer to the fire. She felt a gust of cold air as he opened the blankets, and then felt his warm skin on her cold body. He shuddered when he felt her next to him. She felt him lay her back against the saddle cushions, and his heavy body lay on top of her, deliciously warm and spreading comfort over her. Allender floated in a sleepy haze, shuddering from time to time as the core of her body, trying to keep warm, sent shivers through her. The fire grew as it began to consume large sticks and coals began to form. The air in the small room warmed up, and Allender began to warm up a little, the combination of body heat and heat from the fire warming her. She became more aware of her surroundings and the fact that she was under a blanket, almost naked with an almost naked man who was not her husband. He seemed huge, and it was very disturbing, especially because he seemed to be standing up straight. "Rains?" She looked into his eyes. "I'm sorry, Allender," he apologized. "You're a very attractive woman to me. We're practically naked here, and we're going to sit like this for a while. I'm not a very sociable guy. I don't think I've ever met a woman like you. You are everything I could imagine that I would like to see in a woman. If you were fat and ugly, the fact that you're so independent, smart, funny, and interested in everything I have would make me want you. You're not fat or ugly. You are stunningly beautiful. You have a body to die for. You feel like silk, and it's very exciting. I think this is the most I've talked to anyone in a year." "Thank you, Rains, that's very flattering, but I'm married," she said. "I understand that perfectly well," he said. "I'm trying to act like a gentleman." "I appreciate it," she said. "Let's forget about it. Let's just stay here and try to keep warm. Do you mind if I sleep?" "Maybe it's better this way. How long do you think we'll be here?" "It could happen in a few hours, or it could happen in a few days. We won't starve, but we'll be thirsty if we don't melt the snow. I have some pots that we can use. I hate to leave you here, but I need more firewood. I'll use the walkie-talkie and tell Peter and your husband that we're safe and hiding in the cave." "I'll be fine," she said. "It's getting warmer now. As soon as my clothes are dry, I'll help you." "I don't need any help right now. You were just scared. Just stay here and I'll be back." In an hour, he piled up a huge supply of firewood, including several large logs inside the cave, and unwrapped part of the moose they had taken. He cut strips from the small of his back and impaled them on green sticks, placing them on the edge of the fire. As the juices began to drip and sizzle, a delicious fragrance began to permeate the air. He went out and brushed the snow, now more than a foot deep, aside and plucked huge tufts of grass, carrying them inside so the horses could eat. He hobbled them, not that they could have gone far in such a storm, and the moose stripes were already ready. Allender was turning them over the fire, and her stomach was rumbling. Her clothes were still wet, so she was wrapped in blankets. Rains took salt out of his backpack, and they ate. It was the most delicious thing Allender had ever tasted. It tasted like very tender beef, and they ate everything they cooked. Rains took 2 metal pots and filled them with snow. They melted the snow over the fire and joined them. He went back and got more, and they repeated the process until they had about half a gallon of clean water. He put it in the outer cave to cool down and covered the fire with large logs to last the night. It was already quite dark, and they decided to get some sleep. Allender stood up, and they made a kind of mattress out of the saddle cushions. It was narrow, less than 3 feet wide, and they barely fit. She lay down, and Rains stripped down to his underpants and socks. She didn't want to look, but her eyes were inexorably drawn to him. He was incredibly muscular. His professional football background was obvious. He had several large scars on his knees, where he had obviously undergone surgery. He didn't have the big belly she usually associated with football players. She assumed that he must have lost a lot of weight after the football days. He slid under the covers next to her. She immediately felt warmer and at the same time very uncomfortable. The only way for both of them to stay on the pads is either to lie on their sides with their bodies touching, or at least half on top of each other. Allender turned her back on Rains, and he did the same. His back seemed very wide and warm to her, and the awkwardness of the situation kept her awake for a long time. Rains didn't seem to have such difficulties, and his breathing was slow and heavy. The rhythm lulled her to sleep, and she dozed off. When she woke up, it was pitch dark, and it seemed to her that she had slept for a couple of hours. They tossed and turned in their sleep until Rains was on his back and she was lying on top of him. Her cheek was resting on his chest, and her breasts were pressed against his side. Somehow, she inadvertently lifted her foot until it was above him. She felt his hand slide down her back and realized with horror that he was awake and knew what she was doing. She didn't know if he knew she was awake, and she thought she would just carefully turn her back on him. She started to move, and suddenly his hand slid down and cupped her buttocks. When their movement slowed and stopped, his heavy weight on her and inside her felt so warm and soothing that she was floating in a sea of euphoria. Rains pulled away from her and hugged her, holding her close while they regained their strength. Her mind began to clear, and when the enormity of what had happened completely dawned on her, she began to cry. She was shaking and sobbing as he held her. "What's wrong, Allender?" "What is it?" he asked softly. "Damn you, Rains," she sobbed. "I shouldn't have let that happen. I love my husband and have never even thought about another man. Now I'm a cheater, and it will never be the same for me. I despise myself and hate you for it. How am I going to meet Brian? Take your hands off me, Rains. I'm going to check if my clothes are dry." She stood there, and he watched with regret as her incredible naked figure disappeared into her now dry clothes. She went back to the blankets and climbed into them. "You will meet him face to face, as always," he said. "No one will ever know that this happened. I'll never tell you. We are two people trapped in a situation that neither of us intentionally created. We didn't cause the storm. We didn't plan on freezing. How in the name of all that's holy can you expect anything else? We were two adults, naked in a pile of blankets in the middle of a snowstorm. It happened, and I refused to feel bad about it. Actually, I liked it, and so did you. You've been here 100 times. I am not your husband's rival in love. I know you love him, and nothing we've done will change that. To tell you the truth, I'm sorry. I wish I had met you first, but that didn't happen. We've been stuck here for God knows how long, and I'm with the sweetest, most gorgeous, and most interesting woman I've ever met. She was naked in my arms, and I swear to God I don't regret anything. Aren't you warm right now?" Allender laughed. "Well, yes, that's a plus. Rains, I really love Brian, and I won't leave him for someone else, not even for you. Are you seriously not trying to take that away from me? If you give me the slightest trouble, I'll come back here, hunt you down and kill you. You'll never see me coming." "Quite seriously, Allender," he said. "As far as I understand, this is a chapter in the book. When I finish reading it, it will be closed forever. I'm not trying to steal you for myself. I know you're not mine and you'll never be mine, but I was lucky to borrow you for a while. I can live with it if you can. Now, I don't really like myself either, but this is an abnormal situation. I know how it happened. I know you're not a cheater. It's just not in you. If that were the case, I wouldn't be attracted to you. We are under a lot of stress, in an emergency situation, and this has just happened. I pray to God that you are mine. You're not, and I'm going to regret it for the rest of my life. I'll just have to live with it. You'll leave. We'll never see each other again, and life will go on. The next chapter in your life will be without my participation." Allender looked out. The snow stopped falling, and she saw the stars in the sky. "This book is over, and I'm going to burn it," she said. "After we leave here, if I ever hear your name or see you again, I swear I will hunt you down and put an arrow in your heart. Be sure, I'm leaving. Are you coming?" Allender was silent all the way home. She didn't know what to do. Her first reaction was to silently live with herself and her guilt, be the best wife a man has ever had, and spend the rest of her life making Brian insanely happy. These thoughts followed her for 100 miles. She will never be able to live at peace with herself. She would never be able to be so deceitful or insincere. Brian deserves better. Damn, she realized. He deserved better than she did. She'll pay the piper when they get home. She curled up unhappily and fell asleep. The journey was endless. She could tell that Brian felt she was upset, but he had no idea what it all meant. She knew that he couldn't imagine what had happened in that cave during the storm. It was unthinkable. She could hardly believe it herself. Allender has never been promiscuous. Before Brian, she had been with 3 men, and she had been in long-term relationships with all of them, and now her weakness and stupidity were eating her alive. Why did she let this happen? This question haunted her every minute. They unpacked their things, and he was sitting in the living room checking his email. She poured 2 glasses of good whiskey and sat down next to him. "Brian, I have to tell you something," she said calmly. He closed the computer and leaned back against the pillows. "Okay, shoot," he said. "I know something's bothering you." "I did something terrible there," she said. The story spilled out, and she felt shame and a burning sense of guilt envelop her like a veil. She saw that he was in great pain and spared him the details that could have caused him even more pain. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, and she wanted to brush them away and take the pain on herself. She could barely control herself and held herself in an iron grip, trying to retell this dirty story in an even and dispassionate voice, as if it were a story written by someone else about a long time ago. "There are two paths ahead of us," she said. "If you want to divorce me, I'll go and pack my things. I know this is what I deserve. I won't complain or whine. I'm not going to insult you by begging, although that's what I'd like to do. I'll sign whatever you decide. I won't dispute anything. I'll leave and never bother you again if that's what you want." "Okay," he said. Allender's heart sank like a stone in her chest. Without saying another word, she got up and began to pull out her suitcases. "What are you doing?" "I'm packing my things. Didn't I understand you that way?" "No, I just agreed with you," he said. "You still haven't marked the second way." She returned and took a sip of whiskey, feeling the heat burn her. "He's not going anywhere," she said. "The second way is to go nowhere. You'll forgive me, I'll repent, and we'll stay married. You're giving me forgiveness. I know I don't deserve this, but this is what I want. I know it's going to be hard, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. I have no right to expect this." "Are you in love with Rains?" "God, no," she said. "I barely know this man. I plan to never see him or hear his name again. It will happen no matter what you decide. I love you, Brian. You're the only man I'll ever be able to love. It's true, no matter what you decide." "If I divorce you, what will you do?" "I think I'll move to Canada," she said. "I've always wanted to live there. This is an athlete's paradise. I'll buy myself a little cabin somewhere in the wilderness. Maybe Dad will come and help me get started." Brian lay motionless, and only the swaying of the drink in the glass indicated that he was alive. He didn't say anything for a long time. "No, I'm not going to divorce you, Allender. I don't want to say or do anything that I'll regret later. But I want you to leave. I don't think I can be around you for a while. Maybe I'll get over it, maybe I won't. Yes, I believe that you don't love him, and you don't want to see or hear about him. But can you forget him? I'm afraid this question will torment me all my life. If I can get through it. If what you're saying is true and you're not going to be with another man, waiting for me to get over it all." "Oh, I'm pretty sure that's true," she said. "Obviously, I can't make any promises that you can believe in, but I think you'll see the evidence." "What happened?" "I didn't plan anything like this, Brian, and you know it." "Yes, I know, Allender. It doesn't matter to me right now. I'm grateful that you're alive. I hate what you've done. I hate you right now. Please go away. Let me know where you're staying." Allender packed her clothes in suitcases. Her brain was paralyzed as she mechanically packed. She needed a box for her personal belongings, and she went through the living room to the garage. Brian didn't move, and she could see the tears glistening on his face. Her heart was breaking. She could almost hear the sound. She managed to pull herself together until she was in the garage. She collapsed onto the workbench. The shreds of self-control evaporated, and she sobbed. Her hand was on something, and she looked down at the tool belt she had given him for his birthday. Her fingers felt the belt, and she was lost in a storm of grief and longing. She didn't know how long she sat there sobbing, but the grief began to recede, and a terrible rage began to take hold of her. Rage at herself, at Rains, at the storm, at everything that had come together to put an end to all her dreams, all her ideas about her own dignity and worth as a human being. She was a dirty little thing, and now she knew that about herself. There was no turning back from this. Her self-loathing grew until she felt the depth of despair. What she did to a loved one sitting with tears in his eyes was unforgivable. He loved her, and she failed. It was the worst possible setback, and she was broken. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Her gun rack hung on the wall. She absorbed the beauty of these instruments of destruction. It seemed appropriate that she should end her pain with something she enjoyed so much. She stood up and took her vintage Browning Sweet 16 off the padded hooks. She opened the chamber and rummaged in the drawer for buckshot. When she found it, she put it in the chamber. "Allender," Brian's voice startled her. "What are you doing?" "No, you don't have to do that. You can't run away and leave me in this. You can't choose the cheap way out. What are you trying to do, ruin my life forever? Don't be a coward. You've never been a coward. Look into the face of the mess you've made and fix it. What the hell is wrong with you? What happened to the girl I married?" She turned to face him. "She's lost, Brian," she sobbed. "She's broken and doesn't know how to move on. I'm so scared. What should I do now?" "I don't know," he said. Not that. Promise me that when you leave, you won't do it. Find yourself, Allender. When you do, let me know. Put the gun down. Allender took a deep, shuddering breath. I promise, Brian. She didn't lower the gun. No, I'm taking it with me to remember. I need all my stuff, Brian. These things are part of who I used to be. Earlier. I'll pack them up tomorrow and send them to where you'll be, he said. He slowly turned around and walked back into the house. Allender put the Browning in its case and carried it to her car. She took the box she came for, took it upstairs, packed her personal belongings and put them in the car. She went into her office for the last time, took her laptop and a photo with Brian. She locked the front door behind her and headed west. She had no idea where she was going, but she knew it would be far away. A couple of hours later, she called Brian and asked him to pack her things in boxes and leave them in the garage until she decided where she was going. 3 days later, she was in Winthrop, Washington. She saw the sign with the name of the city of Conconuli and felt a connection. It was a quaint little town that could only be reached by snowmobile in winter, and Allender fell in love with it. There was a rental store with an apartment above it, and she got a job in it. She sent Brian her address, and 2 weeks later her things arrived. Allender was well off financially, and she spent a month just getting to know the neighborhood and the locals. She found that she could rent large tracts of land for hunting and fishing. She opened a tour guide service, and by the arrival of summer she had her first clients. They were fishing for trout, and she really liked this job. Physically she was fine, but inside she felt dead. Her heart was damaged, and she spent time alone whenever possible. She cried at night, every night, and began to think that she would never be happy again. She was amazed that one 6-hour stretch of life could cause such destruction. She wrote to Brian once a week, and he always replied. When Brian watched Allender leave the house, he could barely restrain himself from rushing after her and begging her to stay. She looked so small, broken, and lonely that it broke his heart. He managed to restrain himself. It was the only way forward. Allender needed to rediscover her inner strength, and she had to do it herself. They will sort out the problems between them when she is safe and sound. He was desperately afraid that in desperation she would forget about her promise and commit suicide, but he knew that she was honorably fulfilling her promises and hoped for it. It had always been like this, except in one case, and it was this broken promise that left her with an empty shell of herself. He hoped that time would heal her. When she called him and asked for her things to be delivered to her, he realized that she was on the mend. Having got rid of this burden of worries, he soon turned to other thoughts. He knew how it happened. The extraordinary circumstances took her beyond the limits of normal reactions. He knew that men were constantly harassing her. It had always been that way, and he had watched her deal with it more than once. He even saw how furious she got when several guys refused to accept the rejection. Allender could turn into a tiger when she was touched, and he saw her break the arm of a man who was groping her in the lobby of the club near the toilet. Had she changed so much that she had just allowed something like this to happen? Was it really all that was required for her character to collapse? Was there an appropriate combination of circumstances? If that's the case, then they have no future with her. How would he know? The main question was spinning in his head. What was he going to do with Rains? What would Allender do if she met this man again? His first reaction was that Rains needed to be punished. He wasn't sure how he was going to do it, but this man was unscrupulous, unprofessional, and he, in Brian's opinion, basically took advantage of Allender's vulnerable state and raped her. Yes, she was an active participant, but in her weakened state, she probably couldn't act like she normally would. He cursed himself for not being able to protect her. If he had been even a little careful and gone with her, none of this would have happened. He did not take any blame for this act, but he was less than vigilant. He had no doubt about his ability to get payback from Rains. The man was big and tough, but he lacked discipline, and Brian was big and tough himself. He was a school and university wrestler and knew his physical abilities. He also knew that he could go to jail if he attacked Rains. It had to be something radical that would not allow for a counterstrike. Father Allender was coming to visit soon. How would he explain this to Thomas? Is your daughter not here because I kicked her out? She's a cheater and I can't live with her? She froze to death, and a man took advantage of her and made love to her, so I sent her away. He didn't want to tell Thomas any of this. Thomas was a man of the old school. He was a retired aerospace engineer and the man Brian respected the most in the world. Brian was desperate for his approval, and he didn't want to explain the situation. but he decided that honesty was the best policy and tried to come up with an explanation. He knew that Allender had not communicated with her father, and this would be a real shock for Thomas. Brian met Thomas at the airport, and the old man kept looking around, clearly expecting to see his daughter. Brian's heart was breaking at the thought that this kind old gentleman would be disappointed. He invited Thomas to lunch at Cheddar's and told him that Allender had left. "What do you mean, gone?" Thomas asked. "Where is she, and why didn't any of you bother to call me and tell me she wouldn't be here?" "To tell you the truth, it's probably because we didn't want you to know," Brian said. "It's a long story, so get ready." A long, painful story spilled out, and Thomas listened in shock as this dirty story unfolded. When Brian finished, there was silence. The tension eased with the arrival of the waiter, and Thomas ordered them both bourbon. "I don't know about you, but I wouldn't mind a drink," he said. They sipped their wine in silence for a while, and finally Thomas spoke. "Brian, I can't even express how disappointed I am in my daughter. I'm really sorry that I let you both down as a father. I can't imagine how you're feeling right now, and I'll do everything in my power to help you. You must also understand that she is my daughter, and I love her with all my heart, and I always will be. I will express my disappointment to her at the first meeting. Then I'll forgive her and still love her. My love for her does not depend on whether she is perfect or even good. I don't love her because she makes me proud or because she's perfect. I love her because she is my daughter. I love her for who she is, not for what she does." "I understand everything, sir," Brian said. "I didn't expect anything else." "So what are you going to do?" Thomas asked. "This situation is unbearable. It is necessary to solve this problem." "I was hoping you could tell me how to do it," Brian said. "Take me home and let me sleep," Thomas said. They had a very gloomy dinner in silence. They went to bed and Thomas lay awake, thinking all night. He got up at 6 and made breakfast. When Brian got up at 7, everything was ready and they were talking over a cup of coffee. "As far as I understand," Thomas explained, "you have very few options. You don't know what Allender is thinking. Maybe you think you don't know her at all. I think what happened is so out of character for her that she's broken inside because of it. It's been 5 months and maybe she's found her way back. She didn't tell you about it, but maybe she's waiting for something that none of us understand. I've decided that the only way back or forward for the two of you is a trial. She will either pass the exam or fail. In any case, there will be a result. Do you think she's ready?" "I have no idea," Brian replied. "What kind of test?" "Let's see, I've kind of thought it through," Thomas said. "From the way you described this Rains, I think he'd jump at the chance to take a second shot at her. I think we should arrange it." "Jesus Christ, Thomas," Brian blurted out. "Are you crazy? That's the last thing I want. You have no idea how many times I've dreamed of killing that bastard. I don't want her near him." "Yes, I understand," Thomas said. "But the real problem is that you have no idea how she'll react if she gets into trouble again. That's the crux of the problem. I think you should tell him through some third party that you've broken up. If he's as predatory as we think he is, he'll jump at the chance. If he doesn't react, it means we underestimated him. If he does, he'll be fair game. He'll find Allender, and we'll see how she reacts. If she closes it, we'll know it was a deviation. If she doesn't, we'll know that she has some deeper character flaw, and you need to move on and leave her to me." Brian thought for a moment. "It's a hell of a risk," he said. "What if he tracks her down?" "Brian, I've hunted on 5 continents. You're very good yourself. We'll be watching her like hawks. I'll kill that bastard myself if he does her any harm. You figure out how to get the message to him, and I'll plan the rest." Asterisk, 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 asterisk. 2 weeks later, Peter Thompson and Reince Parker had dinner together at their base camp. "Tell Parker," Peter said. "Do you remember that cute couple who were here 6 months ago? Their names were Brian and Allender Celine. They both took the moose, and you were stuck with her for a while. She was very hot. Do you remember?" Parker looked at Peter but said nothing. "The boss said they broke up," Peter said. "It's a real shame. I thought they really loved each other. Do you know anything about this, Parker?" Rains blushed. "What are you implying?" "I'm not hinting at anything," Peter said. "I'm asking you directly. Do you have anything to do with their breakup? You can confess like a man. I think your face speaks for itself. You talk to me like that again and I'll rip you in half," Rains growled. "Huh," Peter laughed. "If you try to attack me, I'll kill you like a dog. Did you get her drunk?" She was cold and you offered to warm her up? Look at you, you damn weasel, right? She froze. And you used her. You bastard. He pulled out a gun. No, you sit back down, I'm leaving. I won't work with a dog like you. Thank God your daddy's not around to see what a piece of shit he's raised. I'll tell the boss what happened. He backed out of the camp, and Rains heard the tramp of his horse coming down the trail. He didn't care what Thompson thought. His mind caught only that Brian and Allender had broken up. He still thought about her every day. He had never wanted a woman so much in his life. In his football glory days, he dated hundreds of women, but no one impressed him as much as Allender. He was going to find her and claim her. Allender was working on her longbow. She made a layered bow using a hickory and bois d'arc backing for the wood. It was a huge weapon, 79 inches long, and it had a huge weight. She practiced this art. She wanted it to be not only functional but also beautiful. She was very proud of it. Someone was knocking downstairs, and she went to answer it. It was one of her neighbors. Lars was a natural boy. That was the only way to describe him. She felt that he was a free spirit, something of a throwback to the hippies, and she liked him. What she didn't like was his persistent attempts to get her to go on a date with him. "Hello, Allender," he said. "I was wondering if you'd like to go get something to eat." "I'm busy, Lars. I'm working on the bow." "You need to eat. Why do you always tell me you're busy? When are you not busy?" "Listen, Lars," she said impatiently. "I like you, okay? You're a very handsome guy. You shouldn't have any problems getting dates. Why do you keep asking me? I'll always be busy. It has nothing to do with you. Have you seen me dating men? You haven't seen it and you won't see it. I'm not going anywhere with you, and if you don't stop bothering me, we won't even be friends anymore. Do you understand? Why don't you want to come with me?" He started to argue, but Allender heard her phone ring upstairs. "I have to answer the phone." She closed the door in his face. Her phone switched to voicemail when she found it. It was under the coat she was wearing earlier, and she didn't recognize the number. Her blood froze in her veins when she heard Rains's voice. "Hello, Allender," she heard. "I know I promised you I'd never remind you of me again. I heard that you and Brian are no longer together. I'm really sorry if this has anything to do with me. The thing is, if you're not with Brian, I'd like to see you. I do not know where you are, but I have this number. Please call me. I need to see you." Allender dropped her phone. The memory of what they had done came flooding back. She remembered the excitement and the excruciating pleasure. She also felt shame and guilt wash over her, as if it had all happened yesterday. Damn that man. She was trying to figure out her life, and now this. She wasn't going to answer his call. She accepted the weakness that had gripped her then, and the way her body reacted to him. It was hard to accept, but she understood that she had a deep character flaw that she needed to constantly be wary of. She didn't quite understand how she could lose control of herself, but she knew how to prevent it from happening again. Now Rains had invaded her life again, unwanted and hostile to everything she had ever hoped to have in her life. She went back to her bow. A million thoughts raced through her mind as she sorted through the ideas. She made an uncertain conclusion and put the bow aside. She had some plans. A good night's sleep would be a great start, and Allender went to bed in full accordance with her plan. The next morning she got up early, had a hearty breakfast, and packed everything she was going to take with her in the car. Driving through Yakima, she changed her car to a four-wheel drive truck. The longbow was in its case, along with the arrows. It had a draw length of 30 inches, and the arrows were 2 inches longer. She was going to use 125-grain wide woodman heads, and they were in a case too. She packed up and headed southeast to Colorado. Brian and Thomas watched her go. They had been following her for a week, not knowing if Parker would call her or not. When they saw her start packing, their hearts sank. Brian was watching her closely through binoculars and saw the suitcase she had packed. It looked like there was a fishing rod, but he couldn't figure out why she took it with her. He and Thomas followed in a rented car and took turns sleeping and driving. Allender hurried as fast as she could, and when she finally stopped, they took turns sleeping in the car. She slept for 10 hours and went to have breakfast at McDonald's. It became clear where she was going, and Brian wanted to leave. "She's coming to him, Thomas." "I don't want to see it. I've had enough." "Stop being such a little fool," Thomas told him. "Grow some balls, man. I'm going to hurt this jerk, and you're going to help me." They were somewhat surprised when Allender turned off the highway and drove into the woods. They watched as she hid her truck behind a bush and took out something. She had a strange suitcase with her, and the two men quickly packed the camping supplies they had brought with them. Thomas packed up the rifles and they set off into the woods, following Allender. She was heading back to the place where the nightmare began, and in a hurry. They took 2 days to get there, and when they got there, there were no signs of life. Allender cautiously approached the camp and looked around. It had been used only recently, and she assumed that Peter and Rains had gone exploring. She went up the path she had used before and saw that the horses' tracks had turned off. She moved cautiously now, stopping to scan the area with binoculars before continuing. She followed the horse's trail for 5 miles and smelled smoke. As she approached, she noticed him and moved cautiously forward. Brian and Thomas realized that she was tracking something and crept closer silently. They watched as Allender took a bow out of its case and stretched it. She put the tips on 4 arrows and put one on the string. Brian whispered to Thomas, "She's going to shoot that fool?" They saw Rains sitting with his back against a large pine tree, eating an apple. They crept closer when Allender was within range. She stayed hidden between herself and Rains until she got a chance to get the right shot. "Should we stop her?" Brian whispered. "Let him play," Thomas said. "This is her show. She has to solve this problem." Allender stood up slowly. Rains heard a sound like a bird flying and felt a hard blow on his right shoulder. Excruciating pain shot through his body, and he realized that he had been pinned to a pine tree by the longest arrow he had ever seen. He heard the sound again, and before he could react, he was hit in the other shoulder. His world went dark. Water splashed in his face and he regained consciousness, spitting. He was in agony. When his eyes focused, he saw that Allender was pouring water from a bottle over his head. He hissed, and she knelt down in front of him. "Hello, Rains," she said. "You shot at me." All he could manage was a hoarse croak. "Yes," she smiled mirthlessly, twice. "I'm going to shoot you." "What the hell is wrong with you?" he croaked. "Will you kill me?" "Yes, as promised." Her voice was steady. "You ruined my life, Rains. You destroyed me. I helped you do it, but I feel better now. I realized that you wouldn't let me move on. You will always be there like a snake crawling through my garden and preventing me from becoming the person I once was. For 6 hours I was a snake too. Then I realized that I was not a snake. I'm taking my life back, Rains. You're losing yours." He looked into her eyes and saw his death. "Please," he managed. "I will never contact you again." "I've never liked the word connection used as a verb," a male voice said. "Another blow to you, Allender? It also seems to me that this promise has been made before. It was a fiction then, and I suspect a fiction now." Allender rolled to the side, and when she got up, she had a very unpleasant-looking .40 caliber pistol in her hands. It was aimed at the man who came up behind her. "Dad," she exclaimed. "What are you doing? How did you find—" She rushed to him, hugged him, and sobbed into his coat. "I brought someone with me," he muttered. Allender looked up and saw Brian appear from behind the cliff. "Oh my God," she sobbed. She was running, and it seemed to her that it was miles. She ran to her husband, all other thoughts disappeared. Brian was here. He went up to her and hugged her, and she was sobbing hysterically on his chest. "Are you going to shoot me?" he asked. She looked at the gun pressed between them against his heart. She threw it away when Brian smiled sadly at her. "Hi, baby," he said. "You're in a pretty difficult position." "What were you going to do with him, Allender?" "What is it?" he asked, nodding towards the unconscious Parker. "I was going to put an arrow between these two, right in the center." "I can't let you do this," he told her. "What are we going to do?" "What is it?" she asked. "You two are going home," Thomas said. "I'll clean up the trash. I'll be there in a couple of weeks. Will you be there?" Allender looked at Brian hopefully. He nodded. "Come to Concanully," Allender said. "I think we need to take our minds off everything for a while." Thomas nodded and watched as his daughter and son-in-law disappeared into the woods, hugging, and the sound of their voices mixed and faded. He smiled. Everything should work. They had walked about a mile when they heard 2 shots. They looked at each other. Brian raised an eyebrow and Allender sighed. They headed down the path.